middle of the woods. He went back to his house, acquired a lantern, and after building up the courage to do so, he ventured into the cave. Miyamoto said that the sense of excitement and wonder he felt that day was something he wanted to recreate in a video game, and thus The Legend of Zelda was born. Why Zelda? Why isn't the franchise called simply The Adventures of Link, like the subtitle of the second installment? I mean, there's a reason why so many people confuse this guy for being Zelda. After all, this green dude is the most iconic thing about the games. Well, when the first game was released in Japan in 1986, it was actually titled The Hyrule Fantasy, with Legend of Zelda being a subtitle. It seems like a much more fitting title, doesn't it? The games are a lot more about exploring the world of Hyrule than about Zelda, but for the North American release, the game was for unknown reasons renamed to simply The Legend of Zelda, and ever since it's been in the title of every Zelda game. "It's dangerous to go alone" is at least one of the most memorable quotes in gaming history, which makes it even more surprising that this scene almost didn't make it into the game. Early in development of the first Zelda game, players would actually begin with a sword in hand. However, when Nintendo tested the game before release, most players complained that the game was too confusing and that they kept getting lost. Rather than fixing the game, Miyamoto insisted on making the game even more complex and confusing, including starting the player off without any means to defend themselves. His logic was that making Zelda more confusing would force kids to share information with their friends and foster a sense of community around the game. And seeing as we're still talking about it, I'd say it worked. Movies based on video games usually aren't that well received. Still, we continue to wish and hope that someone will make a good movie about our favorite franchise, and Zelda is no exception. While there have been unconfirmed rumors about a live-action Zelda movie for decades now, a leaked video from 2007 reveals that Imagi Studios pitched the idea of an animated movie to Nintendo. However, seeing as the movie never got made, we can only assume that Nintendo was afraid of this happening again. Early in development, Miyamoto planned for the first game to also take place in the future. And when I say the future, I mean a very futuristic, high-tech sci-fi type future. This is also why Link is named Link. He was supposed to serve as a link between the past and the future. Miyamoto has also stated that his green clothes and overall design were inspired by Disney's version of Peter Pan, and the similarities are awfully similar. Except for the hair color, they look almost exactly the same. Neither of them age or have any parents, and both of them have a flying magical companion with wings. The noises the choo-choos make in The Wind Waker is actually a sped-up clip of two men arguing in Japanese. While working on Ocarina of Time, Miyamoto had the idea of making the game in a first-person perspective. The camera would only go into a third-person mode when confronting an enemy. However, director Yoshiaki Koizumi, who also designed the 3D model for Link, disliked the idea and wanted Link to be visible at all times. He, along with others, managed to convince Miyamoto of this, and thus a third person was chosen instead. But if you're still curious what the game would look like in first person as well as on the Oculus Rift, the modding community got you covered. In fact, you can even play the original The Legend of Zelda, yes, the top-down 2D game, in 3D first person. In The Legend of Zelda, the first 5 dungeons of the second quest spell out the name Zelda. On a similar note, the third dungeon in the first quest looks like this. But it's not what you think. In Japanese, this is a symbol of good fortune called manji. It's also facing the other direction compared to the Nazi symbol. The most iconic Zelda theme of them all, this one. Almost never happened. In the beginning, Nintendo planned on using a famous orchestral piece titled Bolero. However, at the last minute they realized that the song was still copyrighted, and thus composer Koji Kondo had to write a new theme song for the game, and he did it in one single day. For many years, in fact many decades, fans have wondered and theorized about the timeline of events in the games. Was every release just a sequel, a continuation of a larger story? Or maybe some installments were prequels, or maybe even completely separate games with little or no connection to the rest? The events in the game certainly spoke for the latter. It couldn't be one continuous story, it just didn't make any sense that way. In the meantime, Nintendo repeatedly stated that there was indeed an encompassing timeline explaining the connection between all the games, but they never revealed it. That is until 2011, when Nintendo released the book Hyrule Historia. For the first time, the story or stories behind The Legend of Zelda was explained. The reason fans had been unable to crack the code, so to speak, was because there wasn't one simple timeline. Instead, after the events in Ocarina of Time, the timeline split into 3. It would take too long to go through all of it, but let's run down some of the major events. The story of The Legend of Zelda begins with Skyward Sword. In the game, Link and Zelda established the Kingdom of Hyrule, which laid the foundation for the rest of the franchise. Later on, the events of the Minish Cap and Four Swords took place. Now we reach the game that complicated everything: Ocarina of Time. Near the end of the game, there's a final battle between Link and Ganon. If you play the game, you know that Ganon is defeated. We are the hero who saved the Princess Zelda and the Kingdom of Hyrule. Now, according to Nintendo and Hyrule Historia, there's also a timeline in which Link is actually defeated during the final battle with Ganon. Ganon goes on to acquire the Triforce, and a war soon breaks out. This creates the first timeline called the Decline of Hyrule. It's basically the dark or evil version of the story. The other 2 timelines were created at the very end of the game, when Zelda sends Link back in time. So there's one timeline for the Link who was various arenas until the player became the Grand Champion, a sort of gladiator type of game. At some point during development, Bethesda decided to include side quests to bring some much needed variation to the gameplay. It wasn't long until they realized that the side quests were a lot more fun than the tournaments themselves. The gladiatorial gameplay was dropped altogether, and Arena became a full-blown open-world role-playing game focusing on quests and dungeons. But there was a slight problem with this decision. All material had already been printed using the name Arena. Even the cover art for the game gave the impression that this is some sort of fighting game with an audience. They decided to add a title, The Elder Scrolls, with Arena as a subtitle to give it more of an RPG sounding name. When it was first released in 1994, it wasn't exactly a success with only a couple of thousand units sold. But as time went on, the game spread through word of mouth and eventually became popular enough to get a sequel 2 years later in 1996. The franchise slowly grew in popularity with each new installment and is today one of the most popular video game franchises out there. Open-world RPGs are known to be quite expansive regarding both features and actual in-game world size. The Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall stands out from most other games because of its ridiculous and, some might say, unnecessarily vast map size. It's just over 160,000 square kilometers. To put that into some kind of perspective, that's almost the size of Florida in the US or 2/3 the size of the UK. I mean, if you think the world of Skyrim was huge, it's not even 0.03% of the size of Daggerfall. It would actually take real-time weeks to get from one side of the map to the other. But Daggerfall ain't got nothing on Arena though. Arena's map size is over 6 million square kilometers. As a comparison, Australia is roughly 7.5 million. It would likely take you several months trying to cross this world. The thing is that almost all of this was done using procedural generation and not by hand. So while these games are not exactly comparable to their finely tuned and handcrafted modern relatives, it is nonetheless an impressive feat for games released 2 decades ago. When Bethesda worked on Oblivion, they considered adding children to the game to make things more realistic. But this proved to be a very difficult decision, because if you could kill children in the game, it would no doubt make for some extremely negative press. But if they made the children invincible, it would undermine the purpose of adding children in the first place, as it wouldn't be realistic. In the end, they decided to exclude children from the game completely. When development began on the next game, Skyrim, this dilemma was brought up once more, and this time they decided to include children in the game, but as most of us know, they were made invincible. However, this decision was most likely made very late into development, because if you use console commands or mods that disables their invincibility, you can actually kill them. But what's interesting here, and possibly morbidly so, is that the children actually make unique noises upon death. This could mean that Bethesda planned for this to happen at some point during development. Furthermore, if the player kills Braith, then Lars Battleborn, who was bullied by Braith, will thank you for doing so.
I don't know what you did, but Braith won't even look at me now, so thanks!
This is even though killing her would of course be impossible during normal gameplay, suggesting that this was at one point a feature in the game. In many Elder Scrolls games you will find subtle references to fish sticks. For example, in Morrowind there's this book called Captain's Guide to the Fishy Stick. In Oblivion, Maik the Liar has this to say:
Maik wishes the had made out of fishes to give to you. Sadly he does not.
If you approach Sheogorath in Skyrim, he also mentions fish sticks.
Do you mind? I'm busy doing the fish stick. It's a very delicate state of mind.
This all began back in 2001 on the official forums, when a user started rewarding others with an image of a pirate holding a fish, or in this case, fishy stick. This practice soon spread outside of the website and grew to become a quite popular meme, and even continues to this day as a sort of greeting when welcoming new users to the forums. Bethesda took note of this and liked it so much that they decided to include fishy sticks in their games ever since. If you find yourself at this location on the map in Skyrim, you'll find a stone bridge near a waterfall. If it's your first time crossing the bridge, you'll witness two goats walking across it. Soon after, a third goat climbs up from under the bridge and joins them. This is a reference to a popular Norwegian fairy tale called Three Billy Goats Gruff, about three goats trying to cross a bridge with a fearsome troll trying to eat them as they pass by. In the fairy tale, the goats manage to defeat the evil troll, and if you take a look underneath the bridge in Skyrim, you'll find a dead troll. In the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, there's an extremely well-hidden sword named Eltenbrand that can only be acquired if the player performs a very specific set of actions. First of all, you need the sword Goldbrand. You must then complete the quest Shashev's Key and then talk to Sir Lonwe. Before doing so, make sure you also have exactly 11,171 gold coins in your inventory. If everything was done correctly, a message will appear saying "Go to Hell, Carolina," and your Goldbrand has been replaced with the Eltenbrand sword. The reason behind this elaborate Easter egg is just as elaborate. The name of the sword is a reference to Elton Brand, an NBA basketball player who once played for the Duke Blue Devils. This is because a designer at Bethesda named Mark Nelson was a big fan of the team, and his username Blue Dev is a reflection of this. In fact, the script that triggers this Easter egg is called Blue Script. The message itself is referencing the North Carolina Tar Heels, the Duke's most hated rivals. The quest Shashev's Key is referencing the Blue Devils coach named Mike Krzyzewski. Shashev's Key, Krzyzewski. And finally, the very specific number of gold coins is a reference to Mark Nelson's date of birth. If you open the console in Skyrim and type COC Windhelm Pit Entrance, you will access a place known as the Windhelm Pit. This small arena of sorts was cut from the game for unknown reasons, but was to be used to get out of prison in Windhelm. To be released from prison, the player would have to fight various characters to gain his freedom. Back in early 2011, Bethesda announced on their blog that if anyone delivers a child on the day of Skyrim's release, 11/11/11, and then names him or her Dovahkiin, they would receive free Bethesda games for life. It's not entirely clear if Bethesda were being serious, but when it comes to fans of video games, there's usually someone out there crazy enough to actually do it. Thus, a boy was conceived on 11/11/11 and named Dovahkiin Tom Kellermeyer. And as promised, he and his parents will have free access to any past, present and future Bethesda-made games. During a quest in the Tribunal expansion for Morrowind, you're tasked with stopping a journalist from printing lies about the king. Once you track him down and talk to him, one of the dialogue options is, "I'm looking for the Eye of Argonia." This is a reference to the title of the second Elder Scrolls Adventures game that was cancelled before release. It was supposed to be a direct sequel to Redguard, but as Redguard sold poorly, they focused on Morrowind instead. The character in the game is supposed to serve as an analog for Bethesda and how they lied about an upcoming sequel to Redguard. The lore in this franchise is vast. It's incredible how much thought has gone into creating this universe, reaching far beyond the scope of the games themselves. Each game takes place in one specific province on the continent known as Tamriel, the exception being the first game, Arena, which actually lets you explore the entire continent, and the Elder Scrolls Online will eventually encompass all of Tamriel as well. But Tamriel is only one of the continents on the planet Nirn. The other major continents and islands are Akavir, Atmora, Yukuda, Piandunay, Thras and possibly Aldmeris if it exists. Very little is known of these other continents and islands, but Tamriel and Akavir are said to be the two largest. The planet Nirn also has two moons called Secunda and Maser, which you've likely observed during some late night adventures. Personally, I used to be an adventurer like you, but then I took an air. Maser is the larger of the two, and Secunda is actually orbiting Maser and not Nirn itself. Nirn exists within the mortal plane known as Mundus. The Mundus was first conceived by a divine being known as Lorcan. But Lorcan could not create the Mundus alone, so he either convinced or tricked other immortals, known as Etada, to assist him in its construction. Those who helped to create the Mundus became known as Aedra, meaning our ancestors, and those who did not became known as Daedra, meaning not our ancestors. Some of the Aedra gave parts of themselves entirely to the creation of the Mundus and became the 8 planets and moons, also known as the 8 Diviners. In very simple terms, think of the Mundus as something similar to a geocentric solar system, just with, a lot of magical stuff. Nirn is the center with the other 8 bodies either orbiting around it or in close proximity. Beyond the mortal plane, we find Oblivion. This is the home to the supernatural entities known as Daedra, those who did not want to create the Mundus and thus continues to exist within the realm